the sands of Utah burned under a relentless sun while a murmur of death spread across the vast desert expanse. Some spoke of an imminent war, not a mere confrontation, but a brutal clash between the United States federal government and the Mormon community led by Brigham Young. And on that dusty horizon, with the thirst for justice and revenge hanging in the air, the Old West was preparing to add a bloody chapter to its legend. Meanwhile, in the offices of Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan was torn between maintaining the cohesion of the Union and quelling what Eastern newspapers dubbed the Mormon insurrection. Concern grew over rumors that Utah had become not just a religious refuge, but a dangerous theocracy challenging federal authority. There was talk that the local militia, the Nauvoo Legion, composed largely of Mormon settlers, had weaponry, discipline, and above all an unwavering determination if attacked. This tension, initially fueled by accusations and distrust, began to take concrete form on the dusty roads connecting Utah to the rest of the country. A contingent of the United States Army, under General Albert Sidney Johnston's command, was preparing to march toward Mormon territory. Known as the Utah Expedition, it comprised wagons loaded with provisions, weapons, and a significant number of soldiers eager to enforce federal law in the arid plains. On the other side, Brigham Young and his followers viewed this military deployment with fear and anger. They heard the echo of past persecutions once more. The death of Joseph Smith in Carthage, Illinois, and the violent expulsions in Ohio and Missouri were still fresh in their collective memory. Now, under the fervent conviction that God had granted his people the land of the mountains and salty valleys, they declared themselves ready to defend their home at any cost. And so, as though destiny's designs had aligned, Utah's side roads and mountain trails began to fill with furtive movement, clouds of dust raised by horses and wagons. Messengers came and went, conveying confidential information and warnings from the east to Salt Lake City and back again. In the saloons and inns of small frontier towns, tales were told of other great clashes in these virtually lawless territories. People recalled with a shudder that only a couple of decades later, in 1876, the Battle of Little Big Horn would occur, when George Custer's 7th Cavalry was overwhelmed by a coalition of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Each mention of that future event was spoken like a prophecy, warning of the latent ferocity in every corner of the West. Nothing was certain except that the spark of war was about to ignite. And amid this tense atmosphere, a caravan of emigrants from Arkansas, unaware of the political and religious powder kegs swirling around them, pressed on along winding paths, dreaming of reaching California's promises. They had no inkling that, within days, the Utah desert could become a hell of blood and fire. The first omens of tragedy resonated in the distant gunshots of militia drills, in the creaking of army wagons, and in the sharp edge of words laden with suspicion. This was the prelude to the Utah War, a conflict that, although less prominent in the history books than the Civil War or the later Native American resistance at Little Big Horn, would leave a profound mark on the history of the United States. By mid-1857, reports from the western frontier were increasingly alarming, pointing to a virtual Mormon insurrection in Utah. The federal government, feeling challenged, appointed Alfred Cumming as the new governor, replacing Brigham Young. But the courage or stubbornness of the Mormon settlers was such that they were not about to allow what they viewed as outside agents to enter without a fight. In the high-level offices of Washington, they believed the operation would be straightforward, an act of authority that would compel Salt Lake City's religious leaders to yield. Yet the hostile geography and the resolve of those living in the mountains complicated matters. The route to Utah was not only long but also passed through inhospitable areas, and the federal expedition soon encountered carefully orchestrated obstacles. Destroyed bridges, dispersed livestock, and mysteriously missing provisions. Ambushes on supply wagons hindered the soldiers' progress, escalating tension and resentment on both sides. The Nauvoo Legion, under Daniel H. Wells's tactical command, one of Brigham Young's trusted lieutenants, applied a scorched earth strategy. They knew they could not openly defeat a well-armed regular army of greater numbers, so they opted for a war of attrition, attacking supply lines, harassing smaller detachments, and using winter to their advantage. Observing the federal troops' difficulties, Brigham Young declared martial law throughout Utah, calling on local militias to mobilize against the advance. During those days, the desert teemed with whispers of espionage and intrigue. Mormon spies, disguised as merchants, approached federal camps to gather information on troop numbers and the location of garrisons. In Salt Lake City, Brigham Young and his Apostolic Council deliberated tirelessly on how to resist without triggering a total slaughter that might ensnare innocents. They debated between faith and diplomacy, yet it was evident that a military path had already been chosen. Amid this tense landscape, several groups of emigrants continued crossing Utah en route to the Pacific. Among them was the Fancher-Baker caravan from Arkansas and Missouri, comprised of families yearning for a fresh start in California. This caravan, known for its substantial livestock and relative prosperity, had heard rumors of the trouble in Utah, but no one fully explained just how flammable the tensions were. The travelers trusted that, despite the Mormons' antagonism toward the federal government, they might still be hospitable toward peaceful passers-by. Yet suspicion and fear had become ingrained among settlers tired of religious persecution and legal challenges. Adding to that were whispers of alleged desecrations by some members of earlier caravans, coupled with distorted claims that certain outsiders had been involved in Joseph Smith's murder years before. The stage was thus set for an explosion. As the Federal Army prepared to hunker down for the oncoming winter, the dusty trails grew even more perilous. No one trusted anyone, and history, capricious as ever, was primed to unleash its horrors in a remote, scarcely known spot. Mountain Meadows, located in southwestern Utah, seemed like an ideal resting place for the Fancher-Baker caravan. The region offered broad green meadows, water sources, and relatively favorable conditions for recovering before the final push to California. Yet the tranquility of this spot was deceiving. Rumors and fears had reached nearby Mormon communities, fueled by a belief that these emigrants were not mere travelers but potential threats. Word had spread, without solid proof, that certain members of the caravan had been involved in Joseph Smith's death, or that they intended to join federal forces against the Mormons. The truth behind these charges remained uncertain at best, but the paranoia consuming the region did not require exhaustive verification. The first signs of hostility came when the emigrants attempted to purchase supplies from neighboring Mormon settlements and were refused. Under pressure from church leadership, local authorities were reluctant to offer help to suspected outsiders. Tensions rose in verbal altercations and hostile glares. Even some Paiutes in the area, Native Americans who had a relatively stable arrangement with the Mormons, were warned that the caravan might pose a danger. John D. Lee, a member of the local militia with close ties to church leaders, began orchestrating an ambush involving both Mormon settlers and indigenous people. The original plan was to intimidate the caravan and prevent them from joining or aiding federal troops. Yet the precise orders who issued them, and the extent of the plan for a murderous outcome remain subjects of historical contention. On September 7, 1857, the Fancher-Baker caravan set up camp in Mountain Meadows, unaware that watchful eyes observed from afar. At dawn, the first shots rang out. Surrounded and overcome by fear, the emigrants formed a makeshift circle of wagons as a defensive barrier. For several days, they fought off sporadic attacks and siege tactics with scant ammunition and dwindling food. Across the lines, The attackers held a strategic advantage yet seemed hesitant. There was concern that a complete massacre could spark an unprecedented federal backlash. Even so, an atmosphere of hatred and suspicion outweighed any sense of mercy. Some local Mormon leaders were said to have discussed leaving no witnesses in their meetings, while others urged a negotiated surrender. In a territory so isolated and amid an undeclared war, nuances were easily lost. When gunfire briefly subsided, a group of men led by John D. Lee approached the encampment bearing white flags and an offer. The emigrants could surrender, give up their weapons, and depart under escort without harm. Exhausted and with no rescue on the horizon, they accepted, clinging to the hope that any promise, even a fragile one, was preferable to certain death. Thus, on the morning of September 11, 1857, began one of the West's most tragic marches. Women and children led the way, followed by unarmed men, while the supposed Mormon escorts and some Paiute warriors flanked them on both sides. That day, the caravan's fate was sealed.
Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and leave me your comment. Your support helps us keep growing to bring you more stories like this one. Thank you very much.
In a moment seemingly stripped of all humanity, the truce broke apart in the most brutal way. Gunfire and blood-curdling screams pierced the air. The men in the caravan were the first targets, killed almost in unison, caught off guard and defenseless. Despite pleas for mercy, many women and children also fell victim shortly thereafter. An estimated 120 people died, though the exact figure varies among sources. Only a handful of very young children, deemed too young to remember, were spared. The place was consumed by a somber silence in that stretch of the desert, broken only by the sobs of those few children who survived due to their tender age. In the days that followed, the attackers' main concern was to erase any trace of Mormon involvement. Various accounts emerged, either blaming the Paiute Indians for the atrocity or claiming that the emigrants themselves had provoked uncontrollable rage. But over time, a range of testimonies and documents would directly implicate members of the local militia, with John D. Lee identified as a central figure in the plot. News of the massacre traveled slowly, but when it reached Washington, it caused a sensation. The sensationalist press lashed out at the Mormon Church, branding it a murderous sect. Politicians and citizens clamored for retribution. The federal government, already entangled in the Utah War, found in the massacre further impetus to accelerate plans for intervention and pacification. Meanwhile, in the icy military camps of Fort Bridger and other nearby areas, the onset of winter hampered a direct advance on Salt Lake City. Sub-zero temperatures and snowstorms delayed the soldiers, who nonetheless had greater resources than the Mormons. Brigham Young's strategy of attrition was working, yet the Mountain Meadows Massacre became a crushing moral burden for the Mormon community. This wasn't a military act against an invading force, it was a crime against unarmed families. Tensions rose to a fever pitch. Some church leaders, privately appalled, feared both the judgment of history and federal retribution. Attempts to disavow involvement and shift blame multiplied. Yet there was an undeniable reality. The horror at Mountain Meadows would be etched into America's collective memory, overshadowing even other legendary frontier conflicts. Word of the event reached native tribes in the region, most of whom preferred not to become entangled in a dispute among white settlers. Even so, resentment deepened on both sides. It was a turbulent era marked by territorial struggles, fanatical fervor, and an army committed, despite circumstances, to enforcing its law. Thus closed a grim chapter in the story of American expansion. Yet the political and human repercussions of the massacre would stretch far beyond the scorched and bloody fields of Mountain Meadows. Over the winter of 1857 to 1858, the Federal expedition under General Albert Sidney Johnston halted near Fort Bridger and other outposts. Severe winter weather and the Nauvoo Legion's tactics prolonged the conflict, preventing a decisive large-scale confrontation. Meanwhile, an atmosphere of tense calm settled over Salt Lake City, where foreign policy, religious authority, and pride clashed at every corner. It was Colonel Thomas L. Kane, a civilian mediator with political connections and a sympathetic ear to the Mormons, who finally managed to forge a diplomatic bridge between the opposing sides. Convinced that neither party wanted total bloodshed, he traveled to Washington to negotiate. His persuasive arguments and diplomatic finesse prompted President Buchanan to offer a general pardon to the Mormon community, under the condition they accept Alfred Cumming as governor and acknowledge federal authority. Thus, in the spring of 1858, hostilities began to diminish. Johnston's army entered Salt Lake City without encountering resistance. Brigham Young, though reluctant, allowed the peaceful transfer of gubernatorial power, banking on the church maintaining its religious autonomy. Still, the bitter taste of distrust lingered. To many Americans, the Mountain Meadows Massacre tarnished the Latter-day Saints' reputation beyond repair, while within the Mormon community itself, shame, fear, and a long silence took hold, one that would persist for decades. As for John D. Lee, years later he would become the only person to be tried and executed in 1877, for his central role in the massacre. Facing a firing squad near the very site of the killings, he paid with his life for an event in which more people had participated, yet whose weight fell almost entirely on him in the eyes of history and the judicial system. The Utah War and the Mountain Meadows Massacre were soon overshadowed by other national upheavals, such as the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and the subsequent conflicts with native nations on the Great Plains, culminating in tragedies like the Battle of Little Big Horn, 1876. Nevertheless, for historians and specialists, the Mountain Meadows Massacre endures as one of the darkest episodes of the Old West, reflecting religious tensions, relentless expansion, and the latent violence characteristic of a frontier forged through blood and tears.